Hey guys, Ramsey here. Welcome to another video. Today we have an early impression video on a mini that was sent to me by the greatest little perfume house in the world, Enchante Perfumes. Shout out to Anuj for sending me this. Actually, he sent me this almost a year ago. And so this just goes to show how I really kind of move at my own pace. The unboxing came almost exactly a year ago with this little bad boy. And this is called Jil Sander Background. So here's the box, and here is the bottle. And I love how back in the day they used to do actual miniatures of the bottle. I wish that came back as a thing instead of these terrible little, samples that don't spray right most of the time anyways. And I have to say that this is an exclusive review on YouTube. Shocking, but true. There has never been a review of Background on YouTube. And technically there still isn't, because this is just an early impression. But, one thing about my channel, and really one thing about me in general that you've probably learned from my constant uploads, is I am tenacious whenever I find something that I love to do. And I love talking about perfume with you guys. I love discovering perfume. And so while it's Friday night and maybe my counterparts are out having a good time, I am testing a new fragrance and uploading for you guys. And the fact that it's an exclusive review is shocking to me, because Jil Sander is an amazing house. In fact, this is sort of the benchmark fragrance that I was saying. Everything before background and previous is a buy. And if you search for Jil Sander Background on YouTube, you'll notice that there's a German commercial that pops up, a little 30-second ad. And one thing that I was able to derive from that commercial is the slogan. And, it's some guy from the early 90s, and, it flashes to like a background shot of like some jaguar walking while he's like walking the beach, probably, looking for his, run into some girl that's also walking the beach looking for him. And there's like this jaguar in the background. But the slogan was very interesting, because the slogan of background is the instinct of life. That's the slogan they decided to go with in 1993. And so when you first spray this, and I've got about a 2.5 hour dry down right here. And one thing I should mention is this fragrance goes on almost like an X-ray. I don't know whether it just kind of matured in the bottle, and because it's a mini, and it doesn't have an atomizer, maybe it just kind of matured in the bottle over the years. I mean, 1993 was a long time ago. Even though it doesn't feel like a long time ago, when you say it, it really was a long time ago. And so maybe this just kind of matured and, got stronger as the years went on. But putting this on really feels like applying an X-ray. It's so oily and thick. And but I really have enjoyed getting to know this. This is not the first time I've worn it, but I'm basically out of juice. This was only about a 4 mil. I think this is a 4 mil, if I'm not mistaken, a 4 mil mini. So I'm out of juice. So I wanted to upload the video. And again, to my shock, there's no reviews of this on YouTube, which really does shock me, because the fragrance community is large and diverse, and there's many people that love vintage perfumes. And so let me tell you what I get from this, but keep in mind, this is just my early impression video, so it's just kind of my 2 cents. But when you first spray this, you're basically hit with this mixture of spicy and sweet, okay? So it starts off kind of like sweet and spicy instead of sweet and sour. And it starts off in true Jil Sander fashion. It's big and beautiful, and you get hints immediately. The first 2 things you're going to notice instantly is the anise note and the fruit note. Okay, those are the 2 main things. Specifically, you'll notice the raspberry. The raspberry is one of Jil Sander's notes du jour that she uses in many of her fragrances. This was actually created by Jean-Francois Lati. And even though when you first spray this, you're hit with that anise, and it's interesting because for a 1993 release, if you know kind of historical times in perfume and what went into fragrances when, you're probably thinking that, wow, anise is kind of one of those notes that you expect to hear in a fragrance that goes back to the 70s and 80s. That's when anise was really prominent. And that's true. However, the anise here and the way that it feels in the fragrance, the texture of it, and the fact that the fruit note kind of instantly comes into play. It joins it as a sidekick, as a wingman, and it specifically makes that anise note feel almost laid back and relaxed and really playful, actually. This is more of a playful fragrance to me. It almost reflects the time period of the 90s. And you have to remember, this came out in 1993, a mere year, maybe even months before the aquatic wave really took off and washed everything away. So this was right at the tail end of what many perfume lovers, if you asked many fragrance lovers to give you a date of when perfume changed forever and never went back to the old days, probably somewhere around 1992, 1993, 1994 is the answer that you would get from many people. So this is right at the end of an era, basically. But it feels playful and it feels almost ignorant of what is coming. It feels, it almost feels like it's pure, it's clean, like it's ignorant of what's around the corner and what's about to wash all of the fragrance industry away, that aquatic wave, if you will. It's innocent. That's a good word. It's innocent. It's this playful innocence. That's the word I was looking for. And I love how background feels like the vintage notes, like anise. So here's some of the notes: anise, tarragon, carnation. 3 huge vintage notes, and lavender. And so when you read the note listing, you're thinking, my God, this is just Jil Sanders doing an 80s fragrance in the 90s. It's not. That's the thing. It's not that at all. But literally, I think that this is one of the best named fragrances, because when you smell these notes, these 80s notes that I'm talking about, so when you smell anise, when you smell tarragon in this, when you smell old school carnation, which is a floral note that was used in many masculine fragrances of the old days. Starting in the 90s, carnation was kind of phased out in masculine fragrances. So when you smell these things, they literally smell like they're in the background. And I think it's one of the best named fragrances ever for that, because this is a fragrance nerd's perfume. So this is a person who is a nerd about fragrances. This is the kind of perfume that I think they would love, because there's these little details. The attention to detail by Jean-Francois Lati and Jil Sander as a house is really amazing if you understand kind of the time that it's created in. Because remember, whenever you smell a vintage fragrance or you test a vintage perfume, you have to remember you're testing a fragrance that gives you basically a perfect snapshot of the world that it was created in and the trends that it was competing against at that time. And so you have to remember that, in the late 80s, there were a couple hits, even in Germany. So the house of Joop put out this little bad boy. And 1989, I think this came out. Pierre Bourdon and Michel Almerac created Yohji Homme. I believe it's Wolfgang Joop. Is it Wolfgang Joop? I can't remember what his first name is, but Yohji Homme. And this is a sweet heliotrope tonka bomb with vanilla. And many people don't like this fragrance, and I would urge you to go try the vintage, okay? It's still sweet, but it's deeper. It doesn't just have this kind of synthetic cough syrup pink smell like the modern juice does. The vintage, where it has the old school Joop symbol up here at the top where it says Homme, and the bottom says distributed by Lancaster. To me, this is the one that makes it worth it. This is a good fragrance to me. I love wearing this in the cold. It just shines in the cold. And this has this tonka-y, vanillic-like smell, but it's much sweeter than background. But I bring that up because this is the kind of thing that it was competing against, especially for a German house. Jil Sander is a German house. Joop, I believe, is a German house, or at least European house. And so you have to remember that that is literally the background of what was going on in the late 80s and early 90s that Jil Sander was competing against. And so when you smell it in that context, the way that the vintage notes, where they're still trying to appeal to the old guard that wants the woody, anise, tarragon, sharp, you know, oak mossy. There's no oak moss in here, but they want that feel from their youth, from what they were wearing in the 80s. But they also maybe want to wear something cool and hip in the 90s. The 90s was a very laid-back decade, right? And this represents that to me. Some of my favorite Jil Sander fragrances of the days were actually from the 1980s. And so if you take things like Jil Sander, for example, Man Pure from 1981. I have a video on my channel on Man Pure. If you're interested in that, you can go check it out. The Jil Sander women fragrances from the 1980s were fantastic. All full bottle worthy fragrances for me. I would buy Jil Sander Man Pure, Jil Sander Man 2 in a heartbeat if I could just find someone that had a fair deal on them where they didn't charge me $100 for shipping or something from overseas. But those are two on my definite buy list. The Jil Sander fragrances for women from the 80s are on my to buy list. If you fast forward through the 80s all the way until things like 87, Pierre Bourdon did Jil Sander Man III for them, and this is sort of their take on dihydromercenol, because in the early 80s there was a fragrance that you may have heard of called Drakkar Noir. It was a huge hit, and so things like this started to come out in the late 80s. Caesar's Man, which is also this green colored juice, came out in the late 80s to kind of compete with Drakkar Noir. And this is actually a really good fragrance. This really shocked me because this has that dihydromercenol note that some people just can't stand. You know, they don't like that sort of freshness. But Pierre Bourdon mixed in this fruitiness, which is sort of a DNA signature of the house of Jil Sander. And then in 1989, they released this, which is one of my favorite Jil Sander fragrances. It's called, well, it depends on the version. One version called it it was originally just called Jil Sander Man, just like this. And that was the Jil Sander Cosmetics version. And I think this is basically the first version. Jil Sander Man. And then it turned into Jil Sander Feeling Man whenever Lancaster took over the distribution of Jil Sander. And you can kind of see there are some differences in the color of the juice. But I just bring this up because we'll talk some more about this scent as we go along with this early impression. But everything from the 80s all the way up until the very last year of the 80s, 1989, was a hit with the house of Jil Sander. This basically does what background is trying to do. It balances sort of this old school garden mentality. Tarragon, anise, lavender, fruits, balsam firs, orris root, cyclamen, raspberry, oak moss, tonka bean, amber, cedar, musk, patchouli, sandalwood, and tobacco. It blends the vintage notes, tobacco, tarragon, anise, balsam firs, with the more, you know, I would say modernized notes. The raspberry, the fruits, the ambers, the tonka bean, the patchouli. It does some of that. And they hit the nail on the head here. And this is an absolute perfect walk the tightrope balance of a little vintage, a little modern, blended to perfection. Alain Alkenbacher of Simrise actually made Jil Sander Man, Feeling Man, whatever you want to call it. And I absolutely adore this stuff. But the reason I bring it up is because, and again, we'll talk about some of the similarities here in a little bit, but by 1993, when Background came out, things had changed. And the world was kind of changing into this, they were moving on from the 80s, things were changing. And there's a few reviewers that actually wrote some very interesting things. Like I said, there's no videos on YouTube that you can just go reference. But I did jot some interesting information. If you go to Base Notes, some of the reviews on Base Notes on Background are very interesting to read. And in particular, and I agree with this, that's why I'm mentioning it, is one person says that Background basically gives you this new type of anise fragrance. And what he's talking about is that if you think of the anise fragrances of the past, you had things like Azzaro pour Homme from 1978 really kicked off this this anise roller coaster for men's fragrances. Obviously, they used anise before this, but this was almost like one of the turning points for anise in masculine fragrances. Barbershop anise fragrance, fantastic. Gerard Anthony created this. And then if you fast forward to 1984, Aramis did Tuscany per Uomo. This is a beautiful citrus anise. It is very, very good. This leathery, like, dry down. And anise was just, seen as like an old style masculine fragrance note. But if you think about it, if you fast forward past Background in 1993 into the late 90s or early 2000s, imagine the more modern anise fragrances. So in 1999, the house of Yohji Yamamoto put out Yohji Homme. And this is a very interesting fragrance because it has liqueur, it has licorice, and it has this anise note. And Luca Turin was infatuated with this fragrance. I think he gave it 5 stars. But this is the 1999 version that was discontinued. The house it was basically owned by Jean Patou. And Jean Patou was purchased by Procter & Gamble right around the time this came out, like a year later. And so they discontinued this almost immediately, a couple years in to its reign. And then later on, of course, they tried to re-release it, failed. The reformulation, they tried again, failed miserably. So this is almost like a little bit of a unicorn, this 1999 version of Yohji Homme. And then if you go forward into the 2000s, you can think of things like Lolita, Lempicka, Eau Masculin. This is a beautiful anise masculine, but modernized with this sort of ambery feel. And the reason I bring this up, and the reason I bring that up, and the reason I wanted to highlight that comment from Base Notes, is it's a very interesting thought exercise. Again, remember I said Background is a perfume nerd's perfume. So you can kind of wear this and your brain can just kind of work in the background. Sorry for the terrible puns in this video. But it can just work in the background. It can think about some of these things. And so imagine, very interesting, mentioning this sort of new modern anise, if you will. It works as almost like a bridge. Background works as almost like a bridge between the old school anise and the new school anise fragrances. And especially since, nowadays you think about many of the fragrances that would try to replicate that type of Anique Minardo DNA that had this sort of ambery. If you know Anique Minardo's work, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This sort of ambery, if you smell things like Boucheron's Jaipur Homme, this sort of, this sort of benzoin-y, ambery, heliotrope thing. She expertly created that. If you smell D Squared's Potion, you'll have an idea of kind of what I'm talking about. Those type of scents. But nowadays, a lot of them use these very amber woody materials that some people just can't stand. Rich Mitch can't stand amber woods, for example. And I'm lucky because I never caught that bug where I just absolutely hate amber woods. But I could see how that note could put some people off. And so if you're of that persuasion where you just can't stand the modern amber wood materials, you're never going to get along with the modern ambery woody scent. So you have to go back to the vintage days. And basically, for me, the scent has notes that if you look at a fragrance like, for example, look at Feeling Man. Just go back to Feeling Man or Feeling Man as an example. And think about Background kind of being notes in the background of Feeling Man. Look at the similarities. They're actually really shocking. Both of these fragrances have tarragon, anise, lavender, bergamot in the top. They also both have raspberry. Feeling Man's raspberry is in the mid, and the raspberry here is in the top. There's also other fruity notes in here too, but this fruity concoction, let's say. And the base, there's also jasmine. They both have jasmine. The base has tonka, amber, cedar, and sandalwood. So there's a lot of similarities. But while Feeling stays rooted in sort of the 80s with this oak moss and tobacco background, moves more into the vanillic territory. So you start to get vanilla and you start to get benzoin. And that vanilla benzoin route is where I think the star of background really starts to show. That's what the fragrance is trying to focus on. It's trying to focus on this tonka, vanillic, heliotrope, superb heliotrope note, by the way. Heliotrope gives off this Play-Doh-like vibe. The texture of heliotrope is almost like Play-Doh to me, like purple Play-Doh. That's what it smells like a lot of the times. Purple Play-Doh. And that purple Play-Doh, you know, imagine balling it up and letting go, and the Play-Doh kind of keeps the shape, right? Or imagine a dentist taking a mold of your tooth, it keeps the shape. That's what heliotrope adds. And so you get this sort of tonka, coumarin, dry, hay, you know, ambery, wavy, ambery like feel with this fragrance. And it's sort of a gender bender, because in background, what they've added that Feeling Man does not have, you know, Feeling Man added things like balsam firs, which remind people of like polo green from the late 70s. You know, it stays, Feeling Man stays, or man, whichever version you have or want to talk about, stays more rooted in the past, right? There's more of that vintage oak moss. There's more of that balsam fir. There's tobacco, and again, that'll remind you a little bit of that polo green era, the days gone by. But there's a little bit of fruits in raspberry and orris root and stuff like that in here, and tonka, and you know, it makes it a little more palatable, let's say, for more modern noses that didn't want the true vintage side of things, whereas background goes the other way. It doesn't have the tobacco or the oak moss. It does have a couple of the notes like tarragon and anise and you know, the tonka and the amber and the woods, but it almost leans more to the future. So it adds more of the notes like vanilla and tonka bean, the stuff that you'll see in fragrances of the future. You know, imagine something like Fève Delicieuse with that huge syrupy tonka. This is syrupy sweet. It's hard for me to wear. I have a hard time digesting this because sometimes I don't like sweet fragrances, and many people love Fève Delicieuse. I'll tell you that. I mean, it is a star on YouTube, according to some. To be fair, I have I believe it's a 2020 bottle, but I could be wrong. It is one of the new ones with the C and the D together. So maybe when it first came out in 2015, it was even better. But the version that I have is syrupy, sickly sweet, and I have a hard time wearing that. But you know, here's a tonka scent that I can recommend. This is Robert Graham's Fortitude. This is one of my favorite modern tonka scents. Robert Graham's Fortitude. And so imagine this sort of syrupy tonka bean like smell, right? And that's where background leans more in that direction. It leans more towards that benzoin, that sort of playfulness, if you will. It's here. It's here in background. Whereas in Jil Sander Feeling Man, it's rooted slightly more in the past. It's starting to hint here. That's why this is almost like a background of Feeling Man to me, because they've kept sort of this this blueprint, if you will, but they've amplified certain things and played with certain things and marketed certain things and pushed certain things to the forefront. So to me, there is what I would call like a playful tonality with background. And what I mean by that is it's almost like an Andy Warhol painting. Did you guys see the box I showed you of this Andy Warhol Pour Homme? This is all one color, but in the box, or if you've seen some of Andy's paintings, you know, it'll be the same thing, but this will be green on one, this will be orange on another, this will be brown on another, and then this will be highlighted a different color, you know, and they'll all, you know, almost feel like they're inverted, like the color scheme is inverted of each other, right? And he kind of plays with that inverted color scheme idea, that backwards and forwards, inside and out. And that's sort of back and forth color scheme, this tonality, this flashing colors, flashing lights. That's kind of what this feels like. It feels like the fragrance, like background, tried to take the fragrance and turn it inside out. Take things that are normally in the background and push it forward. And that's why the base of the tonka and the benzoin and the amber, which normally stays kind of in as a base note, and maybe it's just what's left on your skin in the dry down, you get that early on in background. That really comes forward. And so it feels like there's this sort of playful tonality. Things that should be in the background are pushed forward. Things that you would expect to be pushed forward, you just don't smell. And then they went with this sort of unisex gender bender role, which CK1 was still, I think, a year or two away at this point. And so it's interesting because you can see Jil Sander playing with this idea, maybe keeping it in the background. I can't help myself, I'm sorry. And you know, they're right there. They're right there in the mix with what was so popular. They just did not step right up to the plate and call it. You know, they didn't say that this is a unisex scent. They marketed it towards men as a masculine scent, which is perfectly fine. But this was the age where it was the risk takers that really started to benefit. The people who used a lot of the cologne, the aquatic scents, or they marketed things as unisex, let's say, or, you know, it was the age of when that really started to take off. And so unfortunately, background stayed in the background, never really took off. I can't help myself, I'm sorry. And it's discontinued now. You know, it never really was a hit. It never really was a hit for the brand. And to be honest, I could see why. I could completely see why. And after giving it more wears and now doing this video and really putting my thoughts on paper, I think I would even say that I may skip this release. I mean, if a bottle falls in my lap for just a price I just cannot pass up, I'll grab it. But I don't think it's going to be right there at the top of the things that I want to grab. I think I'm going to focus on some other things and probably say that for Jil Sander's, the house, that Jil Sander Man or Feeling Man, kind of staying in the 80s is your best bet. I still need to hunt down Jil Sander Man Pure and Man 2. Those are the two main ones on my list that I would love to hunt down. But they're painstakingly hard to find at a fair price. So I'm just kind of keeping my eyes peeled. But as a early impression, I hope you guys felt that I did this video justice. And you know, this is an exclusive review, so I hope you guys like the content. Do like, subscribe, you know, leave a thumbs up. It does help the YouTube algorithm. It's funny, when you search for Jil Sander background, some of my other videos come up because I probably put it in a list or something, but there's almost no information on this on YouTube, which is sad. So I hope this helps some people. I hope this helps some vintage hunters give some exposure to background. It's a worthy scent. But I don't think it's worth huge money. You know, if you can find this for maybe under $100 or something like that, maybe you go for it. But the sweetness just really puts me off a little bit, you know. And as someone who doesn't really care for sweet fragrances, there is just a little, the sweetness is amped up to compete with something like this. And so if I want this, I'll just wear this. I'll wear Yoop Homme, you know. So thanks everybody for watching. It's been a pleasure. I hope to see you guys again very, very soon. Cheers. Take care. Bye-bye.